The chair will recognize Mr. Stanton from Arizona for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for allowing me to participate in the subcommittee to discuss an issue of great importance and urgency to my home state in Arizona. Administrator Criswell, communities along the southern border are on the front lines of an ongoing humanitarian crisis. Right now, federal migrant holding facilities are well over capacity. Last week, DHS began unnoticed release of migrants on the streets of small, rural Arizona communities like Bisbee, Nogales, and Douglas, Arizona. And instead of providing the necessary resources to support these border communities in housing, feeding, transporting vulnerable migrants, the federal government has shifted federal assistance away from Arizona to other states and made it much harder for local governments to get reimbursed for costs incurred. Now, I'm a former mayor, and I know how tight municipal budgets are, but frankly, it is insulting that the federal government is forcing them in to such a precarious financial position. Administrator, I'm particularly concerned about FEMA's complete lack of transparency in how the Shelter and Services Program funds are allocated, and why such a disproportionately small amount of the overall funding has come to Arizona's overwhelmed border communities. In its June guidance, FEMA stated simply that eligible applicant allocations were, quote, based on release and destination data received from CBP and Emergency Food and Shelter Program humanitarian requests made in fiscal year 2023, unquote. No other information was provided for how these funds would be allocated. The Southern Arizona Coalition, which includes Pima and Santa Cruz counties, the city of Tucson, and Catholic Community Services, has a combined monthly costs that have averaged more than $2 million a month this summer, and their costs are steadily rising as DHS releases more than 1,000 migrants on average every day. But they were eligible to apply for just $10.9 million in assistance through the Shelter and Services Program, while New York, 2,000 miles away, received 10 times that. I've been told the funds Southern Arizona has received will only last about 5 months. That's due in part to deep cuts these local governments and nonprofits that were forced to make in other areas. It is simply not right. Administrator Criswell, why is there such an enormous disparity between the resources allocated to border communities compared to interior communities under this program? Shouldn't the needs of Arizona's border communities and those in other border states be weighed more heavily when allocating these critical funds?
Representative Stanton, we know that there is great need out there for these funds, and through our legacy program, the Emergency Food and Shelter Program, humanitarian, with the direction of Congress to establish our new Shelter and Services Program, we used our legacy program to administer the first portion of that funding, which highly favored our border cities. As we implemented the Shelter and Services Program, we did begin to take into greater account release data, but also destination data, as we understand that communities across the country are incurring costs as they're providing shelter and services for the migrants. As we move into the next fiscal year, and if the program continues to be funded, we will be basing this more on a competitive program to take into account the existing data and impacts that communities are experiencing as we make decisions for future funding allocations.
So are you committing today that FEMA will make this moving forward a competitive grant program like the Emergency Food and Shelter Program to disperse funds?
The Emergency Food and Shelter Program was not a competitive grant program as compared to our traditional grant programs. The Shelter and Services Program will be more of a competitive program similar to our other grant programs.
I'm happy to hear that there'll be additional rounds of funding. When that funding occurs, how will you address the significant shortfall by Arizona's border communities in responding to the increased number of asylum seekers being released by DHS?
This program, even through our legacy program, but as well as the Shelter and Service Program, continues to be oversubscribed, and I anticipate it will continue to be oversubscribed. We will use data collected from CBP to help make those decisions, but again, we know that many communities will not get enough funding for the costs that they are incurring.
SSP funding is far more restrictive in covering costs incurred by local governments and NGOs. Why are SSP funds so much more restrictive than the funding received previously under the Emergency Food and Shelter Service Program? What was the rationale for capping hotel costs now when it previously wasn't capped?
I would have to go back with my team on some of the specifics on how we made those decisions and those requirements within our program. But again, this program is a new program for FEMA. This was the first iteration of the Shelter and Service Program. We always continue to improve based on the lessons learned on the initial allocation of those funds. Happy to continue to work with you and your staff on ways we can continue to improve.
Madam Chair, I have one final quick question, if I might, dealing with extreme heat, another important issue to Arizona. Are extreme heat declarations eligible for a Stafford Act disaster declaration, or does the Stafford Act need to be amended to include extreme heat conditions?
The Stafford Act does not need to be amended to include extreme heat. We base our decisions on a number of factors, mostly on what does it exceed the capacity of the state and local jurisdictions. If the response to an extreme heat incident exceeds the capacity of a state and local jurisdiction, they are very open to submit a disaster declaration request, and we will consider that based on whether or not it exceeds their capacity.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. The chair